The rain hammered down on the cracked asphalt outside the Iron Promise clubhouse like a relentless drumbeat, turning the gravel lot into a slick mirror of sodium lights from the distant highway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of leather, stale coffee, and the faint tang of engine oil that clung to every surface. It was a Thursday night, the kind where the brothers gathered not for revelry, but for the quiet rituals of brotherhood. Pool cues clacking softly, low murmurs over worn cards, and the occasional strum of an old guitar in the corner. Hawk Daniels, the club's weathered enforcer, leaned against the bar, his calloused fingers tracing the rim of a half-empty glass. At 48, he carried the weight of too many roads not taken, his face etched with lines from desert suns and the ghosts of promises whispered in foxholes long ago. The door burst open with a gust of wet wind, and in stumbled a girl, no more than 13, her hoodie soaked through, clinging to her slender frame like a second skin. She was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her pale cheeks, and her eyes, wide, red-rimmed, darted around the room as if searching for an anchor in the storm. Sobs racked her body, raw and unfiltered, cutting through the haze of cigarette smoke like a siren's call. The room fell silent. Cues froze mid-stroke. Cards lay forgotten on the table. She collapsed against the nearest wall, sliding down until she sat in a puddle of her own making, hugging her knees to her chest. "My dad. He doesn't know who I am anymore," she choked out, her voice breaking on the words. The girl, Mila, as she'd later gasped between tears, had wandered into the wrong place at the right time, or so it seemed. Her story spilled out in fragments, pieced together by the bikers who gathered around her like shadows lengthening at dusk. Eric Dawson, her father, 45 and forged in the fires of distant wars, had come home a hero 6 months back. But a roadside blast in some forgotten valley had shattered more than his helmet. It left him adrift in his own mind, a vessel cracked and leaking memories. Now, in their isolated cabin on the edge of the pines, he stared through her like she was a stranger passing on the street. No recognition in his eyes, no warmth in his touch. Just silence day after day, as he sat by the window, lost in the fog of what the doctors called a traumatic brain injury. Hawk knelt before her, his leather vest creaking softly, the Iron Promise patch, a coiled serpent around an unbreakable chain, catching the dim light. He'd seen that look before, in the mirrors of his own regrets. A promise he'd made to a fallen brother in the sands overseas. Look after the ones left behind, no matter the cost. Eric Dawson wasn't one of theirs, not by blood or ink, but the girl's plea stirred something primal, an echo of vows etched into the club's very soul. "Tell us where he is, kid," Hawk said, his voice gravel low, steady as an idling engine. Mila wiped her face with a trembling sleeve, pointing vaguely toward the winding backroads that snaked into the hills. The cabin was a 30-minute ride, she said, past the old mill and the rusted bridge, where the world grew quiet and the trees whispered secrets to the wind. Word spread like wildfire through the clubhouse. Phones buzzed under the bar, engines revved in the lot as brothers filtered out into the downpour. Jax, the young prospect with tattoos fresh from boot camp, clapped a hand on Mila's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore." By the time the clock ticked past midnight, the convoy was forming, nearly 100 riders, their bikes gleaming under the rain-slicked lights, a thunderous assembly that turned heads from the highway. Hawk mounted his vintage Harley, the beast rumbling to life with a deep, resonant growl that vibrated through his bones. He glanced at Mila, now bundled in a spare jacket too big for her, perched behind Lena, the club's medic and a woman who'd patched more souls than wounds. The girl's eyes, still shiny with tears, held a flicker of hope, fragile as a match in the gale. They rolled out in formation, a serpent of chrome and leather cutting through the night. Headlights pierced the darkness like stars fallen to earth, tires hissing on wet pavement, the collective roar drowning out the storm. Hawk led the pack, his mind replaying fragments of his own past, a letter from his sister, unread for years, buried under the weight of the road. Eric's story mirrored too many, the war that took pieces of a man, leaving families fractured in its wake. But the Iron Promise wasn't built on forgetting. It was forged in remembering, in riding out to reclaim what was stolen by time or fate. The road climbed, twisting through fog-shrouded pines that loomed like silent sentinels. Mila clung to Lena, her small hands fisted in the fabric of the jacket, whispering directions over the wind's howl. The cabin came into view just as the first hints of dawn bruised the horizon, a modest structure of weathered wood, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, a single light flickering in the window like a lonely beacon. The bikers eased to a halt, encircling the place without a word, their engines cutting off one by one until silence reigned, broken only by the patter of lingering rain and the creak of cooling metal. Hawk dismounted first, his boots sinking into the mud. He approached the porch slowly, Mila trailing behind, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The door was ajar, as if the house itself sensed the gathering storm of souls outside. Inside, Eric sat in a threadbare armchair, his gaze fixed on the middle distance, a man adrift in an ocean of blank pages. Scars traced his temple, faint reminders of the blast that had rewritten his world. Hawk paused in the doorway, the scent of pine and neglect washing over him. "Eric Dawson?" he called softly, voice carrying the weight of unspoken oaths. The man stirred, his eyes focusing slowly but no spark ignited. Mila stepped forward, her arms crossing instinctively over her chest, a habit her father had always teased her about, the way she mirrored his own guarded stance. "Dad? It's me, Mila." The words hung in the air, fragile threads in the web of memory. Outside, the bikers waited, a chosen family ready to weave the silence with stories of roads traveled and promises kept. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that danced like echoes of battles won not with fists, but with the quiet power of presence. In that moment, as the group settled, some leaning against bikes, others sharing flasks of hot coffee passed around, the air hummed with potential. Jax pulled out an old harmonica, its notes weaving through the mist like a lifeline. Lena murmured to Mila about the brain's hidden paths, how sounds and smells could unlock doors long bolted. Hawk watched Eric closely, noting the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers drummed a forgotten rhythm on the armrest. It wasn't a miracle unfolding, not yet, but the seed of redemption, planted in the fertile ground of loyalty. The ride had just begun, and with it, the promise that some bonds once forged could bridge even the deepest voids. The dawn light crept through the cabin's grimy windows like a hesitant intruder, painting the worn floorboards in hues of gold and grey. Eric Dawson remained in his armchair, his broad shoulders slumped under the faded flannel shirt that hung loose on his frame. The scars on his temple caught the faint glow, silver threads against the stubble-shadowed skin, reminders of a life interrupted by shrapnel and silence. He didn't turn at Mila's voice, didn't flinch at the creak of boots on the threshold. Instead, his eyes stayed locked on the window, where raindrops traced erratic paths down the pane, mirroring the fractured paths in his mind. Hawk stepped fully inside, the floor groaning under his weight, and gestured for the others to hold back. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of untouched meals and the musty undertone of isolation. A half-eaten bowl of oatmeal sat on the side table, congealed and forgotten, next to a stack of unopened letters from the VA, crisp envelopes that spoke of bureaucracy's cold indifference. Mila hovered near the door, her arms still crossed tightly, fingers digging into her elbows as if to anchor herself against the tide of rejection. She bit her lip, the taste of salt from earlier tears lingering, and whispered, "He's like this all the time now. Just gone." Outside, the bikers formed a living barrier around the cabin, their presence a quiet thunder that had faded to a murmur. Jax leaned against his bike, the harmonica still warm in his hands, its reed notes lingering in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Lena unpacked a thermos of strong black coffee, passing tin mugs around with nods and half-smiles, the steam rising in lazy curls that cut through the chill. The group was a tapestry of hard miles and harder choices, grizzled veterans like old Tom, whose fingers bore the ink of forgotten wars, and newer faces like Riley, a former nurse who'd traded scrubs for leathers after losing her own brother to the same invisible wounds. They didn't crowd or clamour. Instead, they settled into the rhythm of waiting, sharing glances that carried the weight of shared oaths. Hawk pulled up a rickety stool across from Eric, close enough to feel the man's shallow breaths, but not so near as to invade the fragile space. "Name's Hawk," he said, voice low and even, like the hum of an engine at rest. "We rode with your girl tonight. She's got fire in her, that one. Reminds me of someone I knew once." Eric's gaze flickered just a fraction toward the voice, not quite connecting, but registering the timbre, the gravel edge honed by years of command in the dust. Hawk leaned forward, elbows on knees, and began to speak, not of pity, but of roads. "Back in '09, in a valley that smelled like hot metal and regret, I made a promise to a brother. Said I'd look out for his kin if the worst came. He didn't make it home whole, but his wife, she got letters from us every month, stories to fill the quiet, kept her going till she found her own way." The words hung there, simple and unadorned, but they stirred something in the room, a subtle shift, like wind through pines. Mila edged closer, uncrossing her arms for the first time, her small hand reaching out to touch the armrest near her father's knee. Eric's fingers twitched again, that same rhythmic tap, faint as a Morse code from the depths. Outside, the harmonica picked up once more, Jax improvising a melody that echoed old barracks tunes, the kind sung around campfires under starless skies. One by one, the bikers joined in, their voices rough but harmonious, recounting fragments of lives intertwined with service, the roar of convoys through hostile terrain, the camaraderie of shared watches, the unbreakable chain of trust that bound them beyond uniforms. Tom shuffled forward from the porch, his limp from an old knee wound barely noticeable in the soft light. He carried a small photo, edges worn from years in a wallet, and held it up for Eric to see. A snapshot of a younger man in desert camo, grinning beside a Humvee, the same set to his jaw that Mila mirrored in her defiance. "This was Mikey," Tom rumbled, his voice thick with the accent of forgotten heartlands. "Served with him, lost him to a sniper's shadow. But before that he talked about home. About a girl who crossed her arms just like you do when she's mad at the world." Eric's head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing, as if chasing a phantom scent on the breeze. The photo trembled in Tom's hand, but he held steady, letting the story unfold like a slow reveal in the fog. Lena knelt beside Mila, her medic's kit open on the floor, not for bandages but for the tools of memory. A small speaker playing faint recordings of ocean waves, the white noise that sometimes pierced the brain's barriers. "Trauma locks doors," she murmured to the girl, "but sounds have keys, familiar ones, in from before the blast." Mila nodded, her eyes fixed on her father, and began to hum a tune she'd sung as a child, a lullaby Eric had made up on deployment leave, words about starry nights and safe harbors. The cabin filled with it, layered over the biker's low chorus, a symphony of echoes pulling at the edges of Eric's void. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, subtle changes emerged. Eric's breathing deepened, syncing with the rhythm outside, and for the first time his gaze drifted to Mila, not through her, but toward her. The way she hummed, arms half crossed again in that protective stance, tugged at a thread buried deep. A flicker crossed his face, not recognition yet, but curiosity, like the first crack in parched earth after rain. Hawk caught it, exchanging a nod with the others through the open door. This wasn't about force, it was about presence, the slow weave of loyalty into the fabric of forgetting. The morning stretched on, the group rotating stories like sentinels on watch. Riley shared a tale of her brother's last letter, how it spoke of promises to return and build something lasting. The air grew warmer, scented with pine sap and fresh-brewed coffee, the cabin no longer a tomb, but a crossroads. Mila's sobs from the night before felt distant now, replaced by a tentative hope that bloomed in the shared silence. Eric leaned back, eyes closing briefly, as if listening to the undercurrent of voices that promised not to leave him adrift. And now, I invite you to leave in the comments, where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. The sun hung midway in the sky now, its rays slicing through the pine canopy like golden blades, warming the damp earth around the cabin. The air carried the sharp tang of wet bark and the faint, comforting bitterness of coffee grounds scattered from the bikers' mugs. Eric Dawson shifted in his armchair, the fabric rasping softly against his skin as the hum of voices outside seeped through the walls like a persistent tide. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the figures in his doorway, but his fingers ceased their idle tapping, curling instead into loose fists on the armrests. It was a small thing, barely noticeable amid the symphony of shared tales, yet Hawk marked it, the first voluntary motion in hours, a ripple in the still pond of his isolation. Mila sat cross-legged on the floorboards near her father's feet, her hoodie draped over her knees like a makeshift shield. The oversized jacket from Lena swallowed her frame, its sleeves bunched at her wrists. But she wore it like armor now, the scent of leather and rain mingling with her own faint trace of soap from the clubhouse bathroom. She glanced up at Hawk, her eyes searching his weathered face for reassurance, and he gave a subtle nod, the kind passed between soldiers in the thick of uncertainty. "Keep going," he murmured to the group outside, his voice carrying just enough to stir the air without shattering the fragile quiet inside. Tom lingered on the porch, his broad back blocking the doorway like a steadfast oak. He pocketed the photo of Mikey and pulled a weathered harmonica from his vest, its surface etched with the patina of countless rides. The notes he coaxed forth were mournful yet steady, a blues riff that evoked dusty trails and midnight confessions under vast skies. It wove into the low murmur of stories from the circle of bikes, tales of brothers lost to the roar of engines or the whisper of wind, promises etched in blood and ink that outlasted the scars. Riley, her voice soft but clear as a bell, spoke of the night she held her brother's hand in a sterile ward, how he'd gripped hers with a final squeeze that said more than words ever could. "He made me promise to keep riding," she said, her eyes on the horizon where the pines met the fading mist, "not to forget the road we shared." Eric's eyelids fluttered, the harmonica's wail pulling at threads deep within. A faint crease formed between his brows, as if chasing a half-remembered dream. The cabin's interior cluttered with relics of a life paused. Faded maps pinned to the walls, a dusty rifle case in the corner, seemed to contract around him, the weight of absence pressing in. Mila noticed the change, her breath catching. She leaned forward, her arms crossing again in that instinctive fold, elbows tucked tight against her ribs. "Dad," she whispered, the word laced with a plea that trembled on the edge of breaking. "Remember the lake? The one we went to every summer before you left. You taught me how to skip stones, said it was like skipping worries across the water." Outside, the bikers leaned in closer, their leathers creaking in unison, forming a human tapestry of vigilance. Jax passed around a flask of something warm and amber, not for numbing, but for kindling the inner fire that kept stories alive. Old-timers like Silas, whose beard was streaked with silver from decades of desert patrols, added his gravelly timbre to the mix. "I knew a fella like you once," he rumbled, eyes fixed on Eric through the open door. "Came back from the line with holes in his head that weren't just from bullets. We didn't push. We just rode by his place every dawn, engines thundering like a wake-up call from the old unit. One day he stepped out, nodded, and that was enough." Memory's a tricky beast, slips away, but it always circles back if you give it the right echo. The sun's warmth intensified, drawing beads of sweat on Eric's forehead, and he wiped them away with the back of his hand, a deliberate gesture that sent a murmur through the group. Lena watched from her spot by Mila, her medic's instincts attuned to the subtle signs, the quickening pulse at his neck, the way his gaze darted to the window where the bikes gleamed like polished shields. She slipped a small vial from her kit, not medicine, but a vial of pine oil, its scent sharp and evocative of training grounds far from home. Uncorking it, she let a drop fall onto a cloth and held it near the air, the aroma blooming like a memory trigger. "Smells can bridge gaps. Words can't," she said softly to Mila, who nodded, inhaling deeply herself. As the afternoon light shifted, casting elongated shadows across the floor, the stories deepened, peeling back layers of the club's own veiled histories. Hawk shared sparingly, his words measured like shots from a well-aimed rifle. "Lost my best friend in a convoy ambush," he said, staring at the floor as if seeing sand-swept roads. "Promised his sister I'd carry the weight. Been riding that promise ever since, through storms, through silence. It's what keeps the chain unbroken." Eric's head lifted then, just an inch, his eyes locking onto Hawk's for the briefest moment. Not full recognition, but a spark, like embers stirring under ash. The room held its breath, the harmonica falling silent, as if in deference. Mila's humming resumed, tentative at first, then gaining strength, a melody from their backyard barbecues, where Eric's laughter had boomed like thunder over the grill's sizzle. She crossed her arms tighter, the posture a mirror of his own in quieter times, when he'd hug himself against the evening chill while telling tales of distant horizons. The bikers picked up the cue, their voices layering in, a chorus of rough harmonies that filled the cabin like smoke from a ritual fire. Tom's harmonica joined again, softer now, underscoring the rhythm of Mila's tune. Eric's hand unclenched, reaching out blindly toward the sound, brushing the edge of Mila's sleeve. She froze, tears welling anew, but this time they were laced with something brighter, anticipation, fragile as dawn's first light. His fingers trembled, tracing the fabric, and a low sound escaped his throat. Not quite a word, but a rumble, like an engine catching after a long stall. The group outside stilled, the air thick with the unspoken vow that they would stay, weaving their presence into the fabric of his recovery, until the voids filled with the unbreakable bonds of chosen kin. Hawk rose slowly, stepping back to give space, his boots echoing softly on the wood. The sun dipped lower, painting the scene in amber tones. And in that glow, the cabin transformed, not from prison to sanctuary, but from echo chamber of loss to forge of quiet triumphs. Eric's eyes, clouded yet, drifted to Mila's crossed arms, lingering on the familiar angle, the defiant tilt that had always been their shared language in the face of life's tempests. A deeper twitch crossed his features, the first hint of a bridge forming across the chasm. The ride toward remembrance was gaining momentum, propelled by the steady hum of loyalty that no injury could fully silence. The afternoon light slanted through the cabin's windows like shafts from a projector, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like fleeting memories. Eric Dawson's hand lingered on Mila's sleeve, the rough pads of his fingers catching the worn cotton, holding on as if testing the reality of the touch. His breath came in uneven hitches, the sound ragged against the cabin's quiet, and for the first time since the biker's arrival, his eyes held a glint. Not clarity, but the raw edge of searching, like a man surfacing from deep water. Mila didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her crossed arms loosening just enough to let her hand cover his, small and steady, the warmth of her palm, a silent anchor. Hawk watched from the doorway, his silhouette framed by the porch's overhang, where the scent of sun-warmed pine mingled with the faint, acrid bite of cooling exhaust from the bikes. He didn't crowd the moment. Instead, he stepped out, signaling to the group with a subtle tilt of his head. The bikers shifted, their leathers whispering as they formed a wider circle, giving the cabin space to breathe while maintaining their vigilant ring. Jax holstered his harmonica, trading it for a battered acoustic guitar slung from his back, its strings humming faintly under his fingers as he tuned it to the fading echo of Mila's lullaby. The instrument's wood was scarred from road dust and rain, a relic that had seen more sunrises than most men. Lena remained inside, her presence a calm counterpoint, kneeling to adjust the cloth with the pine oil until its sharp, resinous aroma filled the room like a bridge to forgotten trails. She spoke softly to Eric, not in commands but in invitations. That smell, it's like the edge of base camp, right? Trucks rolling in at dusk, boys sharing smokes and stories to chase the dark. Eric's nostrils flared, a subtle inhale that pulled the scent deeper, and his free hand rose to his temple, tracing the scar's faint ridge as if mapping a route back. Mila's voice joined Lena's, tentative words weaving in. "You used to say the pines whispered your name when we hiked that trail. Remember? You'd point out the shapes in the branches, make up stories about guardians watching over us." Outside, the group's murmur swelled again, voices layering like overlapping waves on a restless sea. Silas took up the thread, his silver-streaked beard catching the light as he leaned against a bike's fender, the metal still radiating faint heat from the morning's run. "Had a squad-mate name of Ray," he began, his tone gravelly, honed by years of desert winds. "Came home with his head full of fog after an IED turned his world inside out. We didn't storm his door. We parked out front every weekend, fired up the grills, let the sizzle of burgers and the crackle of laughter do the work. One evening, he wandered out, smelled the smoke, and just sat. Next thing, he's telling us about his kid's first bike ride, like the pieces clicked back into place over a shared plate." The bikers nodded, the story resonating like a familiar chord, their faces a mosaic of quiet resolve, eyes shadowed by visors, jaws set under the brims of worn caps. Tom joined Silas, pulling a small tin from his pocket, its lid etched with a faded emblem from some long-ago unit. Inside were matches and a few hand-rolled cigarettes, but he used it instead to strike a light for a lantern hanging from the porch beam, its flame flickering to life with a soft whoosh. The glow pushed back the encroaching shadows as the sun arced lower, casting the pines in elongated silhouettes that stretched toward the cabin like reaching arms. "Fire's got a way of calling things home," Tom said, his limp carrying him to the steps where he settled, the wood creaking under his weight. "Reminds you of campouts, of nights when the stars were your only map. Eric, if you're hearing this, know we've all got fires that burned low once, but embers, they wait for the right breath." Eric's grip tightened on Mila's sleeve, not painful but insistent, drawing her closer until she knelt beside the armchair, her knee pressing into the frayed rug. His eyes, clouded with the haze of injury, drifted downward, fixing on her arms, now uncrossed but the memory of their fold lingering in the way her shoulders hunched protectively. A low rumble built in his chest, not words yet, but a sound like distant thunder rolling over hills, the prelude to a storm breaking. Hawk caught Lena's eye, a silent exchange passing between them. Progress, fragile but real, born not from force, but from the steady drip of shared humanity. He stepped back inside, his boots deliberate on the floorboards, and crouched to Eric's level, voice low as an engine's idle. "We've all lost chunks of ourselves out there, brother, but the road, it leads back if the crew's got your flank. Your girl's been carrying the weight. Let her show you the way." The guitar strummed to life under Jax's hands, a slow, resonant picking that evoked the hum of tires on open highway, the vibration syncing with the pulse of the group. Riley added her voice, clear and unadorned, singing a fragment of an old service ballad about homeward-bound souls and the chains that bind them. The melody carried through the open door, wrapping the cabin in its embrace, and Eric's head turned toward it, following the notes like a compass needle to true north. Mila hummed along, her free hand tracing circles on his knuckles, the simple motion a ritual from their pre-war days, when he'd do the same to soothe her scraped knees after a fall. As the light deepened to burnished copper, the air thickened with the scent of earth cooling and the faint herbal trace of wild mint crushed under shifting boots. Eric's rumble coalesced into a whisper, fragmented and rough. "Lake. Stones." Mila's eyes widened, tears spilling over as she nodded fiercely. "Yes, Dad, skipping worries. You promised we'd go back someday." The spark in his gaze intensified, chasing the shape of her crossed arms in memory, the defiant posture that mirrored his own unyielding spirit. The biker's chorus swelled, a tapestry of voices and instruments that filled the voids, not erasing the trauma but illuminating paths through it. Hawk rose, the group's energy a palpable force now, like the rev of engines before a long haul. Eric's hand released Mila's sleeve only to reach for her shoulder, a tentative pat that spoke volumes in its hesitation. The cabin, once a hollow shell, pulsed with the rhythm of chosen family, the promise of redemption etching itself into the fading day. Outside, the pines rustled approval, their whispers carrying the weight of oaths fulfilled, one quiet victory at a time. If this tale of quiet strength and unbreakable bonds has touched you, hit that like button below. It helps these stories reach more souls in need of hope. The evening shadows stretched long across the cabin's yard, turning the pine needles into a carpet of ink underfoot, as the bikers' lanterns cast a warm, flickering halo around the perimeter. The air cooled rapidly, carrying the crisp bite of impending nightfall mingled with the earthy undertone of damp soil and the lingering smoke from Tom's lantern flame. Inside, Eric Dawson's hand rested on Mila's shoulder, the weight of it light but deliberate, like a compass needle settling after a storm. His whisper, "Lake. Stones," hung in the air, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of his fractured mind, and Mila's tears traced silent paths down her cheeks, her small frame trembling with the force of held-back sobs. Hawk remained crouched nearby, his breath steady, watching the subtle play of emotions across Eric's face, the furrow deepening in his brow, the way his eyes, still veiled in haze, searched Mila's features as if piecing together a puzzle long scattered. He didn't press. Instead, he rose fluidly, his leather vest shifting with a soft creak, and nodded toward the door. "Let the night in," he said to Lena, who understood immediately. Crossing to the window to unlatch it wider, the sounds from outside flooded the room. The low crackle of a small fire Jax had kindled in a metal pit, the strum of his guitar weaving through the rustle of leaves, and the murmur of voices sharing flasks under the stars, emerging one by one. Mila shifted closer to her father, her hand still clasped over his, the warmth between them a quiet defiance against the encroaching dark. "We skipped them so far, Dad. You said the best ones make 5 bounces before they sink." Her voice was a thread, fine and unbroken, pulling at the edges of his recall. Eric's fingers flexed, not in withdrawal but in response, tracing the line of her arm down to where her elbow bent, an echo of the crossed posture she'd held earlier. The one that mirrored his own guarded stance from days when worries were just ripples on a pond. A deeper rumble stirred in his chest, words forming haltingly. 5. Yeah. Worries. Sink. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the walls absorbing the moment like old timber soaking up rain. Outside, the group adapted to the deepening twilight, their circle tightening around the fire's glow, faces illuminated in oranges and reds that danced like embers of shared resolve. Silas stoked the flames with a stick, sparks rising in lazy spirals toward the canopy, each one a fleeting testament to persistence. "Fire's like memory," he said, his voice carrying through the open window, gravelly and assured. "Starts small, needs tending, but once it catches, it warms the whole damn night." Riley nodded, passing a tin cup of herbal tea, chamomile steeped strong to soothe without dulling, and added her piece. "My brother used to say the same about letters home. One line at a time, building the picture till you could see the whole scene." The guitar's melody softened, Jack's picking out a rhythm that evoked the gentle lap of water on a lakeshore, the notes syncing with Mila's whispered recollections. Lena monitored from the sidelines, her medic's gaze sharp on Eric's vitals, the steadying rise and fall of his chest, the color returning to his cheeks under the lantern's light. She slipped a small notebook from her kit, jotting notes not for records, but for the group's collective memory, a ledger of triggers that worked, scents of pine, tunes from the past, the tactile anchor of a daughter's touch. "It's layering," she murmured to Hawk, who leaned against the doorframe, arms folded loosely. "Not a flood, but a tide coming in slow. Give it time, and the shore remembers." Hawk grunted in agreement, his eyes on the horizon where the last sliver of sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and fading golds. Tom shuffled inside then, his limp softened by the rhythm of the evening, carrying a plate of simple fare. Sandwiches wrapped in foil from the clubhouse cooler, still warm from the fire's edge. He set it on the side table without fanfare, the scent of fresh bread and smoked meat cutting through the staleness, a sensory nudge toward normalcy. "Eat up," he rumbled to Eric, not expecting a reply, but offering the gesture as another thread in the weave. Mila took a bite first, chewing slowly, her eyes never leaving her father's face, and Eric's gaze followed the motion, a faint hunger flickering in his expression, not just for food, but for the familiarity of routine. As the stars sharpened overhead, the stories evolved, the bikers drawing from deeper wells. Old-timers recounted convoy runs through moonless nights, the thrum of engines a heartbeat against the unknown, promises exchanged in the glow of dashboard lights to watch each other's backs. Jax shared a newer tale, his prospect's ink still fresh on his arms. "Joined up after my old man faded out, same fog, different war. The club didn't fix him overnight, but they rode the miles with him till he found his way back to the grill on Sundays." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks, and Eric's head turned toward the window, the crackle mirroring the sparks in his mind, igniting fragments. The sizzle of lakeside fish fries, Mila's laughter skipping like stones across the water. Mila leaned her head against the armrest, her crossed arms now a loose drape over her knees, the posture a bridge between past and present. Eric's hand slid from her shoulder to her hair, fingers threading through the dark strands with a gentleness that spoke of muscle memory, untainted by the injury's grasp. "Mila!" The name emerged as a breath, rough around the edges but whole, and she lifted her face, eyes wide with wonder. "Dad." He nodded, the motion slight but seismic, his eyes clearing just enough to hold hers, seeing the girl who'd crossed her arms in defiance of storms both literal and lost. Hawk stepped forward, the floorboards sighing under his weight, and placed a hand on Mila's back, a steadying force amid the swell of emotion. Outside, the group sensed the shift, their voices quieting to a reverent hum. the guitar fading to single notes that lingered like afterimages. The night enveloped the cabin, cool and profound, but within its walls warmth bloomed, not from flames alone, but from the unbreakable chain of loyalty that linked strangers into kin. Eric's recall was a road still unfolding, paved with echoes of promises kept, but in that moment the fog lifted enough to reveal a landmark. Home, in the shape of a daughter's unyielding hope. The fire's embers glowed steadily as the hour grew late, the bikers settling into watches, their presence a silent vow that the journey wasn't over. Eric pulled Myla closer, the gesture instinctive, and whispered of stones and sinking worries, the words a foundation for the nights to come. Hawk watched from the shadows, the weight of his own old oaths lighter now, shared among the chosen. The pines whispered overhead, guardians of secrets reclaimed, as the first stars wheeled into full view, witnesses to redemption's quiet advance. The night deepened around the cabin, the stars now a vast canopy of pinpricks against the velvet sky, their light filtering through the pine branches in silvered shafts that danced across the weathered walls. The fire pit's embers pulsed like a slowing heartbeat, casting flickering shadows on the bikers' faces as they rotated shifts, some dozing against their bikes with arms folded, others murmuring in low tones that blended with the night's chorus of crickets and distant owl calls. The air had turned crisp, laced with the smoky residue of burning pine logs and the faint herbal edge of the chamomile tea cooling in tin cups scattered on the ground. Inside, Eric Dawson held Myla close, his arm draped over her shoulders with a possessiveness that felt both new and ancient, as if his body remembered what his mind was only beginning to reclaim. Myla nestled against him, her head resting on the armrest, the rhythm of his breathing syncing with hers in a quiet harmony that chased away the chill seeping through the cracks. His whispers of stones and worries lingered, evolving into fragmented sentences pulled from the depths. That summer, you skipped one 7 times, laughed so hard you fell in. She smiled through fresh tears, the warmth of his voice wrapping around her like the oversized jacket still draped over her lap. I did. You said it was magic, Dad. Our magic. Eric's fingers absently traced patterns on her sleeve, the motion evoking long-ago evenings by the lake, where fireflies had mirrored the stars and promises were sealed with skipped pebbles. Hawk lingered in the doorway, his silhouette a steadfast outline against the lantern's glow, the scent of his leather vest mingling with the room's evolving aroma of rekindled life. Breadcrumbs from the untouched sandwiches and the subtle earthiness of Myla's hair after a day in the rain. He caught Lena's eye across the room. She was repacking her kit with deliberate care, her face illuminated by the soft light, revealing the faint lines of exhaustion etched from years of mending more than flesh. He's anchoring, she said quietly, her voice a thread in the hush. The touch, the words. It's building neural paths, but night brings its own shadows. We stay steady. Hawk nodded, stepping out to the porch where Tom sat, whittling a small piece of wood into an indistinct shape. The knife's scrape, a rhythmic counterpoint to the night's breath. The older biker looked up, his eyes reflecting the embers like polished stones. Reminds me of 12, Tom rumbled, the words emerging slow as sap from a tapped tree. Fella named Harlan. Same fog after a convoy hit. We camped outside his trailer for weeks. No demands, just the fire and the stories. One dawn, he woke yelling his kid's name. Full recall, like the sun burned it clean. But it wasn't the light, it was us, holding the line till he could see it himself. Hawk leaned against the railing, the wood cool and splintered under his palms, and felt the echo of his own unspoken burdens lighten further. The iron promise wasn't just ink on vests. It was this the unyielding vigil that turned strangers into sentinels, weaving loyalty into the fabric of fractured lives. Jax approached from the fire pit, his guitar slung low, strings still humming faintly from the earlier ballad. He settled on the steps, the wood groaning under his weight, and began a soft fingerstyle melody. Notes that evoked the roll of waves on a pebbled shore, gentle and insistent. The sound carried inside, drawing Eric's gaze to the window, where the stars framed the scene like a natural proscenium. Mila stirred, humming along instinctively, her voice blending with the guitar in a duet that pulled more fragments from her father. The boat, we fixed it together, leaky old thing, but it floated. Eric's words came clearer now, laced with a gravelly warmth that hadn't surfaced in months, his free hand gesturing vaguely as if outlining the hull in the air. Outside, the group sensed the progress, their murmurs shifting from tales of loss to ones of quiet victories, convoy reunions under desert moons, letters that bridged oceans, the simple act of a shared ride that mended what wars tore asunder. Silas rose from his spot by the fire, joints creaking like an old engine, and tossed another log onto the flames, the fresh wood crackling as sap bubbled and popped, sending a shower of sparks skyward. "That's the stuff," he said, his silver beard catching the renewed glow. "Keeps the cold at bay, reminds you the night's not endless." Riley joined him, her nurse's hands wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and added a verse to Jax's tune, her clear tone cutting through the dark like a beacon. Words of harbors safe, and promises that outlast the tide. Lena moved to the armchair, checking Eric's pulse with a light touch on his wrist, the beat strong and even now, a far cry from the erratic flutter of dawn. "You're coming back," she whispered, not to him alone, but to the room, the words a balm for Mila's lingering doubt. The girl looked up, her eyes shining in the low light, and crossed her arms loosely over her chest. A habit reborn in this moment of reconnection, the posture that had first tugged at her father's buried recognition. Eric's gaze followed the motion, a slow smile cracking the edges of his stoic features, faint but real, like dawn breaking through fog. "Arms like mine," he murmured, the observation simple yet profound, sealing the bridge with the intimacy of shared quirks. As midnight approached, the air grew heavier with dew beading on the bike's chrome like tears of relief, and the pines swayed in a gentle breeze that rustled their needles like whispered approvals. Hawk signaled a brief rotation, sending a few brothers to scout the perimeter, not for threats, but to ensure the night's peace held, their footsteps soft on the needle-strewn ground. Inside, Eric shifted, pulling Mila onto the armrest beside him, his arm encircling her fully now, the gesture protective and paternal, unmarred by the injury's veil. She leaned into him, the weight of 6 months' isolation lifting like mist under the sun, replaced by the solid warmth of presence. The guitar faded, Jax letting the final notes dissolve into the night, and the group fell into a companionable silence, broken only by the fire's soft sigh and the occasional pop of settling embers. Hawk returned to the doorway, his shadow long across the floor, and watched father and daughter in their fragile reunion, the way Eric's eyes, clearer now, traced the lines of Mila's face, piecing together the girl who'd waited through the void. It wasn't complete, not yet. Shadows of doubt lingered in his furrowed brow, hints of the trauma that might resurface with the morning. But in this interlude, under the watchful stars, the chosen family stood firm, their loyalty a forge that tempered wounds into strength. Tom pocketed his knife, the whittled shape emerging as a rough-hewn stone, flat and smooth, a token for skipping worries, and placed it on the porch rail, a silent offering for the days ahead. The night wrapped the cabin in its embrace, cool and profound, but within, embers of memory glowed brighter, fueled by oaths that bridged the unbridgeable, Eric's hand squeezed Mila's shoulder, a promise renewed in touch, and she smiled, the curve of her lips a beacon in the dim. Hawk felt the pull of his own road, the ghosts quieter now as the pines stood sentinel, their whispers carrying the legacy of honor reclaimed, one heartbeat at a time. The vigil continued, a testament to the power of staying, until the first light hinted at horizons yet to unfold. The first light of dawn crept over the pine ridge like a tentative promise, painting the cabin's roof in soft pinks and golds that filtered through the mist-shrouded branches. The air stirred with the fresh bite of morning dew, carrying the faint charred whisper of last night's embers now reduced to grey ash in the fire pit. Birds called tentatively from the canopy, their songs a fragile counterpoint to the night's lingering hush as the bikers stirred from their makeshift camp. Blankets folded neatly beside bikes, tin mugs rinsed in a nearby stream's trickle. Hawk stood at the edge of the yard, his breath visible in the chill, watching the horizon where the sun promised to burn away the last veils of fog. The weight of the vigil pressed on him, not burdensome, but affirming, like the steady thrum of an engine after a long haul. Inside the cabin, Eric Dawson sat straighter in his armchair, the dawn's glow catching the silver in his stubble, and the faint scars that mapped his temple like faded road signs. Mila slept curled against his side, her head on his lap, one arm draped loosely in that familiar crossed fold, even in repose, a silent emblem of their shared resilience. His hand rested on her hair, fingers threading gently through the strands, the motion unhurried and instinctive, as if the night had woven back the threads of fatherhood one touch at a time. The room smelled of cooled pine oil and the subtle warmth of bodies close after isolation, the staleness of months giving way to something vital, like earth after rain. Lena entered quietly through the back door, her boots muffled on the rug, carrying a fresh pot of coffee that steamed with rich, dark aroma, grounds coarse from the clubhouse blend. She poured a mug for Eric, setting it on the side table with a soft clink, the ceramic warm against the wood. "Morning comes with new starts," she said, her voice low, eyes assessing his clearer gaze, the way it lingered on Mila, not drifting but holding, piecing together the girl from fragments of recall. Eric took the mug, his grip steady, and inhaled deeply, the bitterness evoking mess hall dawns overseas, where coffee had been the glue binding weary squads through the haze of exhaustion. "Smells like a home," he murmured, the words rough but complete, no longer whispers chasing shadows. Outside, the group roused fully, engines idling low in a respectful rumble that vibrated through the ground like a waking heartbeat. Jax slung his guitar over his shoulder, the wood still bearing the night's dew, and Tom stoked a small breakfast fire, the crackle of kindling sharp in the crisp air as he skewered strips of bacon over the flames, the sizzle releasing a savory tang that wafted toward the cabin. Silas and Riley moved among the bikes, wiping down chrome with oilcloths that whispered against metal, their movements a ritual of readiness, not departure. Hawk joined them, his vest zipped against the morning chill, and scanned the faces etched with the quiet satisfaction of oaths fulfilled. "He's surfacing," he said simply, the gravel in his voice carrying the weight of battles won without a shot fired. Mila stirred as the sense reached her, blinking awake to find her father's eyes on her, clear now, the fog lifted like mist under the climbing sun. She sat up slowly, uncrossing her arms, and met his gaze, her breath catching at the recognition there, full and unshadowed. "Dad?" The word was a question and a prayer, hanging in the light that streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes, swirling like confetti in celebration. Eric's hand cupped her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her jaw, the touch paternal and profound, bridging the void with the intimacy of rediscovered bonds. "Mila," he said, his voice gaining strength laced with the timbre of pre-war evenings by the lake. "My girl. The arms, like mine." Skipping stones, worries sinking, I remember. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, the curve bright against the dawn, and leaned into his palm. The cabin filled with the sound of her laughter, light and bubbling, chasing away the last echoes of silence. Eric pulled her into a full embrace, his broad frame enveloping her small one, the flannel of his shirt soft and worn from months of neglect, now reclaimed. Outside, the bikers paused, sensing the shift through the open door, the subtle hitch in breaths, the warmth blooming in the air. Lena slipped out to share the news, her nod eliciting murmurs of approval, rough hands clapping shoulders in silent solidarity. Hawk entered then, his presence filling the doorway like a sentinel stepping down from watch. He knelt before Eric, meeting the man's eyes levelly, the shared language of warriors unspoken, but understood. "We rode for you, brother, not because of blood but promise, the kind that outlasts the blasts and the blanks." Eric nodded, his free arm extending in a clasp that Hawk met firmly, the grip sealing an alliance forged in the night's vigil. "Heard the stories," Eric said, his words measured but sure. "The fire, the songs, pulled me back, like the unit never left." Mila beamed between them, her arms crossing briefly in that defiant fold, a gesture now a symbol of triumph, the posture that had unlocked the door. The group gathered on the porch as the sun rose higher, its rays warming the dew-kissed ground and turning the pines into pillars of gold. Breakfast, shared around the fire, bacon crisp, coffee hot, became a feast of reconnection. Voices overlapping in easy rhythm, tales of lakeside skips, convoy laughs, the unbreakable chain of chosen kin. Jax strummed a victory tune, notes lilting like stones on water, while Tom passed the whittled stone to Mila, its smooth surface cool in her palm. "For the next worries," he rumbled, and she skipped it across a nearby puddle, counting 5 bounces with a grin that mirrored her father's. Eric stood at last, Mila's hand in his, stepping into the light where the bikes gleamed like faithful steeds. The convoy formed loosely, not for departure but for a slow roll homeward, engines purring in harmony. Hawk mounted his Harley, the beast awakening with a deep growl that resonated through the clearing, and glanced back at the cabin, no longer a prison of fog, but a hearth rekindled. The ride ahead would carry Eric and Mila forward, supported by the Iron Promise's shadow, a family chosen in the fires of loyalty. As they pulled away, the pines whispered farewell, their branches swaying in the breeze, guardians of promises that had bridged the deepest voids. Redemption wasn't a blaze, but a steady flame, enduring through the miles, a legacy of honor etched in the roar of engines and the quiet strength of staying true. In the days that followed, Eric's memory solidified piece by piece, under the club's watchful rides, weekly gatherings where stories flowed like rivers carving stone. Mila crossed her arms less in defense, more in pride, her father's hand often mirroring the gesture in shared resolve. The Iron Promise expanded its chain, Eric joining their ranks not as a shadow, but as a brother reborn, his scars now badges of battles won with presence over force. Hawk rode on, the ghosts of his own vows quieter, the road ahead paved with the moral justice of bonds that time couldn't erase. And as the sun crested fully, bathing the convoy in its embrace, the world felt a fraction less cynical, redeemed by the silent power of loyalty's ride. Thank you for joining this journey of remembrance and unbreakable bonds. If these tales of chosen family and quiet courage move you, subscribe for more stories that honor the heart's deepest promises. We ride together.